Welcome to the ISM Rochester January membership meeting. Next month, February 8th, we will be hosting our Lunch and Learn webinar with Klaus Villaval. He's the Global Procurement Category Leader for Capital Projects for Corteva AgriScience. He will be speaking on Capital Construction Playbook. It's a program that he developed. It should be a very interesting program, so please be sure to register. Also look for our February newsletter, which should be out in a few weeks. We would like to hear from you tonight, so please use the chat function, or if you have a question and you'd like to ask your question live, please just raise your hand, and then we'll call on you when Jane is free to answer the question. Now, this time, I'd like to turn the program over to our president, Leanna.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first membership meeting of 2023. I can't believe 2023 is already here. It's just wild, but we're so excited to have you all here tonight. Our speaker tonight is Jane Tierney, and the topic she will be presenting on is dealing with shortages and disruptions within the supply chain. So Jane, we're so excited to have you tonight, and I'm gonna have you take it away.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here. I've been with ISM Rochester a couple times and always enjoy your meetings and your attendees. So as Leanna said, we're going to talk about shortages and disruption. So we'll just kind of dive in this Happy New Year for everyone. So hope everyone is enjoying 2023 so far. So if you haven't heard very much about me, I've been in operations and supply chain for a long time, more years than I usually care to admit. I've been a consultant since 2015 when I started my own company, purplelink. I am an engineer by trade, I always say, with an MBA, but I also have lots of other little things that I add into my education, my formal education. I hold a green belt from the University of Michigan. I have CPSM and CPSD credentials. I'm also authorized by ISM to teach CPSM and CPSD courses. So I'm happy to do that. I'm actually starting a class on that in early February. So if you're interested in that, it's an online class for CPSM. I also have a Scrum certification that I got in the last couple of years. So that has a lot to do with software, but really it's project management, breaking things down into pieces. I teach part-time in the CSU system. That's the California State system because I'm in Los Angeles. I live in this area. And I teach things like operations management and supply chain management, that kind of thing. So I enjoy the teaching. I enjoy being with the students. I really don't like to grade stuff and I don't like to give grades, but I really like the teaching part and the interaction. So my practice in consulting focuses on assurance of supply, process improvements for companies, always reducing cost. And that includes looking at inventory, scrap, other forms, all forms of waste. I'm a big believer in metrics, KPIs, and also objectives and key results, which comes from John Doerr. If you haven't read his book on Measure What Matters, that's an interesting read. I would suggest you check that out. And he's worked with companies like Google and some other startups. So it's an interesting
I'm on a webinar.
Way to look at that. So I do have a green belt, so I believe in Lean and Six Sigma. Spend analysis is one of the things that I focus on with my clients. Where's your money going? Who are you spending it with? And then overall supplier management. And I'm writing a book. I've been doing that for the last year and a half. So hopefully 2023 is my year to get that published. And it's on supplier management. So that's a little bit about me. And here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about disruptions and different types of disruptions. We're going to talk about some of the impacts, some of the causes that cause disruptions. We're going to talk about some actions you can take to prevent and deal with these. I usually do a raffle at the end and give away some prizes. So if you want to be part of the raffle, then you need to email me at jane@purplelink.co. There's no M on there. So if you want to be part of that, then you can email me now and I'll look at the end, and I've got a fancy little app on my phone that does random number generation. Or if you're not quite ready, I'll give you a chance at the end to go ahead and put your name in. So disruptions. When I look at a lot of different things, I always start with, I always go back to my Webster's dictionary. I have one on my phone. I have one next to my desk. I have one in the living room where we have some other books, but I like to have dictionaries around, always have. And Webster's tells us that disruptions or disrupting is to break things apart, to disturb or interrupt. And those of you who are supply chain professionals and have been through this a few times know that we see all kinds of different disruptions in the business. Everything from supplier actions to our own internal teams that say, whoops, we made a mistake, we need to change something, to the marketing people saying we need to make something different, or things like unnatural pandemics that all of a sudden change our plans. So anything that disturbs and interrupts the plans that we make, the production that we've determined we're going to be making for the next week, 3 months, 6 months, year, whatever, what we've told our suppliers we're going to be doing, what we've told our stakeholders, our shareholders, any of those things are disruptions. And we look at these in terms of an event that's causing this unplanned production, unplanned change in production, in sales, and distribution. So again, natural disasters, regional kind of conflicts, pandemics, all of that kind of stuff. Anything that's an external force, and that external force is something that happens outside your business, one that you didn't create, but that's having an effect on you, as well as the things that your business does create because circumstances change, people make errors, companies change and decide to promote one product over another, or change their lineup, have new products to introduce, whatever that is going on. And those things go on all the time. Excuse me. So we're going to look at some of those. And when we have these external forces acting upon a business's ability to produce, to make, to ship, to acquire, or sell products, all of that goes in there. And that's all of the things that we're going to look at and talk about today. So with different types of disruptions, some are more positive, like a demand surge, which is good for the business. Oh yeah, we anticipated X level of our forecast, and guess what? The sales are coming in strong, and we actually think now that we can sell 1.2 times that number, or 1.5 times, or we're going to double our sales forecast. So that's great for the business, but then it usually falls back on supply chain and operations people to figure out, okay, now what do we do about that? So these problems, these interruptions can be very positive. And of course, they can be the other way. They can be severe or significant drops in demand, where we all of a sudden the sales aren't manifesting, and the marketing guys, as good as they are and as hard as they worked, they had this projection of we're going to sell this much. And guess what? We just aren't selling anywhere near that much. So now we have to say, okay, what do we do about that? And how can we modify? How can we change? How can we adjust to that kind of thing? We see these things that happen in small numbers, and then we see these huge kinds of numbers. If you remember back almost 3 years ago, and it kind of almost pains me to say that when this pandemic first got on all of our radars, and everybody stopped traveling for a while. So airlines experienced disruptions in demand as much as 95% in April of 2020 compared to the year before. Now we're seeing that come back, and in some cases we're seeing a 50%, 60%, 70% increase over the previous year or 2 years ago. We saw a lot of surges. Remember the toilet paper issues back almost 3 years ago? Again, 3 years seems like way longer than I think it should be, but we have these kinds of things. And so we're looking at what changes about the business. We still have things like chip shortages. Companies are dealing with this. Automobile companies are dealing with this. Electronic companies are dealing with that. Now we have the fossil fuel automobile debate versus the electric vehicle, and all of that kind of thing is still going back and forth. The demand is kind of a moving target, and everybody's trying to figure out what it's going to be and how it's going to be. There's the states passing laws. California passed a law where I am. California passed a law about outlawing the sales of new new fossil fuel vehicles as of, I think it's 2035. So it says like, oh, well, 2035, but then you look and you say, well, it's not that far away. So things can change between now and then, but we see a lot of disruptions. And then we know things like supplier shortages. So the supplier didn't get our order, or the supplier had an issue and they're not shipping on time. Or we had some of the myriad of natural disasters we've had. There has been some pretty severe snowstorms, and in your part of the world, you guys got hit with some awful weather this winter so far. And winter, I know, isn't over in Rochester yet. Here I am in sunny Southern California. We've been deluged with just rain, but I know that in your part of the world, there's been a lot of other types of challenges, including lots of snow and slowing things down, slowing transportation, people not able to get to work, people that can get to work, but they can't get the trucks in to get the products, or either get the supplies in or get the finished products out that have to get shipped to other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So there's a lot of different things going on. We're seeing restrictions in storage, warehouse contamination from things. There was the hurricane that we had, Hurricane Ian in Florida, not that many months ago. And there were a lot of buildings that were damaged and they couldn't get the inventory in or out. So companies and some of my clients were affected by that because they weren't sure what they had. They couldn't get in to figure out if it was good and usable, and they couldn't figure out where to put the stuff that was scheduled to come in that was still coming in from different parts of the country. So we have those kinds of issues. We have quality issues that goes across the board. Unemployment is down and companies are hiring and they're changing things around. So when they have this kind of thing, we get sometimes we have quality issues from that. So anything that's outsourced and that can be affected by that. We always say Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and at the worst possible time. I've worked in operations long enough. I know that Murphy is alive and well. So there are a lot of different things going on, a lot of different types of disruptions to businesses around the globe. There are lots of opportunities for these things to happen. The longer our supply chains are, the more complicated they are and complex, that we have global supply chains. So there's a lot of different opportunities for things to go wrong. So when we talk about disruptions, and I've given you a lot of examples of that, you want to look more about some of these issues, things like material shortages, other disruptions. You want to be able to kind of quantify that and look at what does that mean and how what's the impact to my company. So it's not only the number of disruptions or even the types of disruptions or shortages. It's also important for companies to look at the impact of these various actions, activities, events that happen to really find solutions or resolutions to the shortages and disruptions, and that help put in preventive actions to keep them from recurring. So that all goes back to risk awareness and risk mitigation type things. So we don't want history to keep repeating itself and having the same kinds and types of disruptions over and over. So we look at things like the event size. How big was this? And then what kinds of tentacles came in to affect our company? Did it just affect one product line? Did it affect multiples? Did it affect just our production? So our production was able to flex and adjust and do some things, or did it affect our customers as well? Is it just around our logistics providers, or does it go from customer to supplier and everyone is affected? So we look at different things that we can do. We look at where the potential is, because we don't want to just wait for these to happen. We want to look at how big it was and how likely it is to occur or recur. So risk has two components. It has what happens if this does, what is the effect on us if this does come to pass, and what is the probability of that. So we look at the impact potential and that probability quantified. I told you I live here in Southern California. We have earthquakes here. So it is not an if we have, it is always about when we have, because we have recurring earthquakes. And so some of these are so minor and mild that a lot of people don't feel them. I have relatives in the Midwest, and my mother was notorious for calling me and saying, "Are you okay? Did you feel that earthquake?" And I would be like, "I didn't know there was an earthquake. I didn't feel anything. There was nothing here. It's not, it's not on our news. It's on your news and back in Kansas City. So don't worry about it." We do have devastating ones, true, and there have been some very serious ones, but they don't happen all that often. The ones that do happen the most often are the little blips, the ones that we don't even feel, or many people don't feel. You might feel in one certain part of the city or whatever. So then the probability is high, but the probability of a serious impactful one is much lower. So you have to put that on that 2-axis scale. What is the impact and what is the probability? Then we want to look at things like frequency. Are these things recurring again and again? Do we have issues with the same supplier over and over, whether it's a quality issue, delivery issue, or whatever? Do we have enough suppliers, the right suppliers? Do we have all of those kinds of things? Because what happens is when we have this disruption, it hits us in a lot of different ways. It can stop production. It can cost money in terms of higher freight costs, higher material costs, equipment, lost productivity because we're working on this problem instead of working on the normal kinds of tasks that we expect to be doing and keeping things moving. It can hurt our sales, our generation of revenue for our company, can cause market share, and it can hurt our brand and our reputation with our customers. So we don't want those things to happen and to hurt the company or hurt the company's ability to deliver on our promises to all of our stakeholders, whether we're a private or a public company, whether we're a nonprofit or a for-profit. So some of the recent disruptions you should all be familiar with. COVID-19, here we are again about to start year 3, or in some measures, they started it in the very end of 2019. So that means we're into that. We're through 3 years and into the 4th year. Businesses were hurt. A lot of forecasting was changed and made it difficult to forecast. Last year, about this time, there was a factory closure, Abbott, in I believe it was Michigan, and that has still repercussions. We still have different parts of that business that are trying to recover, because it took them until like July to reopen, and once they reopened, they had weather that was terrible, knocked some roof off, and caused the factory to close again. So if you have infants or you use infant baby formula for a variety of reasons, you've seen that in the last year. Again, that's not closed. Much of that is behind us, but there are still pockets of the country that can't get the kinds of baby formula that they can get, and they still can't stock as to the levels that they had pre that factory closure. Semiconductors, again, man, this started in 2020. We're 2 years in, going into the 3rd year, and it's still happening, and it's projected to go through this year. And now I'm seeing projections that say we're not going to be through it until sometime in 2024. And this is one of the things I talk to my students about, and they say, "Oh, well, build more factories." But if you aren't familiar with the electronics business, you just don't put those factories up and start cranking chips very quickly. It can take 4 and 5 years to just build the factory, get all the equipment, get that all permitted and ready to go, and then you can start building the chips. In the meantime, the technology sometimes is changing. The demand is changing. Like I say, we're looking at gas powered vehicles, fossil fuel versus electric. That's across the board, not only cars, but trucks and other types of vehicles. It's looking at the technology, the computers, the phones, all of the things that use different types of chips. So all of these things are kind of being stirred all at the same time. Transportation strikes. There's been a nurses strike going on in different parts of the country, not that far from you. I believe New York City is one of the bigger ones. So that, if you think, oh, well, that's in New York, but that's not necessarily so, because the strikes affect the hospital's ability to handle patients. They affect things that go, because there's so much now communication and even sharing of information and resources from hospital to hospital across the internet and across the country, in terms of things like donors and surgeries and things like that, specialists. So strikes can be one, and we've looked at some potential strikes from truck drivers and trains. We had that rail possible strike in the fall that was avoided. So all of those things come in. The Ukrainian invasion, which is another thing that's going on a year. So in February, that will be a year, which is just about 3 or 4 weeks from now is that anniversary. And holy cow, who thought about that? We're seeing that affect grain shipments. We're seeing that affect components, different types of businesses, some of which people were completely unaware that were being done in the Ukrainian area or by Ukrainian citizens. And now we're seeing those ripples in those supply chains from all of those events. And there's so many more. We know that the pandemic continues. There was a study that was done, a recent survey by a company called Alex Partners. They interviewed about 3,000 executives, and they said that 72% of the CEOs are worried about keeping their jobs in this kind of year time frame. So in 22 and 23, the first half of 2023. And 77% of those executives don't feel the actions that they've taken or that they have planned are going to be sufficient to meet their goals. So they're worried about their own performance with the company. They're worried about the performance of the company. And we're seeing all of these things kind of bubble up. So we've seen more and more shortages and disruptions. We've seen a lot of these issues get bubbled up to senior exec levels, where before a lot of these things were dealt with really on the front line. They were dealt with by the on hand, maybe the director level of businesses, taking care of a lot of these disruptions and issues, and not really affecting very much senior executives unless they were extreme. Now we're seeing a lot more of these that get to that level because they're a lot more impactful, and because there's a lot more tentacles in these supply chains. So the same study found disruptions were the main concern of almost 70% of these executives. And those concerns are made up of material shortages. About a third of those execs that said that disruptions are their main concern. A third of that was due to material shortages, about another third due to rising costs of transportation and availability of material. And then the last one of significance was about 18% said that they were concerned with disruptions coming from unexpected events and not enough transportation capacity. So we've seen that across the board in a last couple of years. Excuse me. We've seen that there were trucks and inability to, maybe there were trucks that were loaded, but there were no drivers to get them from point A to point B. In other instances, they couldn't get enough trucks or enough containers to this point. They had containers, but they were in the wrong location. And so they couldn't get to those to fill those to get them where they needed to be. So lots and lots of challenges for over and above things like the IT, cybersecurity, which has always been an issue for senior execs. It's always, recently it's been a big deal, the changing rate of technology, and of course, COVID-19 and the latest variant, whatever it is, and all of those other types of things that we've seen around that. Here in California, we've had something called RSV, which is, I forget, it's respiratory something virus, and that has affected a lot of people. It wasn't COVID, and it wasn't COVID related as far as I've seen any information on, but it was also a big impact to a lot of workplaces. And I mentioned before, I teach at the university, the Cal State system. We've gone back and forth between online classes and in-person classes, and there's pluses and minuses to both. But I have classes that are like 50 kids in a class, and I say that term kids loosely because they're all ages, but my students are generally junior and senior level. And 50 people of any size in a room with someone being sick, the chances are more people getting sick is much higher. So do you tell the students to stay home? Do you let them come to school sick, or do you allow them to do that knowingly? Do you put things online so that they have access to that? And then the students that just don't feel like coming to class, they want to go online. So it's hard. It's the same thing for workplaces. You tell people don't come to sick work, but do you allow them to work from home, where if they feel well enough to do that, at least partial of the day, then they don't have to take the full day sick leave, and they can work and keep up with their work. So how do we do this? And we're all just learning and getting through all of these kinds of things. So there are a lot of shortages and disruptions that companies experience, and these are for a lot of different reasons. Some companies don't evaluate and manage risk well. Others do a much better job. Some don't anticipate, or we get hit by something unforeseen. Natural disasters like snowstorms, hurricanes, floods, fires. We have fires out here. We have some floods in the torrential rains we've had, which for many parts of the country, these are not torrential rains. They're kind of normal, but we don't, for an area that gets maybe 10 to 15 inches of rain a year, getting all of that in about 3 weeks in January is disconcerting. So in supply chain, we talk about flexibility, we talk about agility, we talk about responsiveness, but we're often forced to deal with these things, with policies and situations that are none of those. The policies are not flexible. They're not promoting resilience. They're not agile. The policy is very, very rigid. So we're looking at things like sole sources. And if you've been in this business at all, you know that sole sources can be risky, but problems with single sources can be just as devastating. If you say, well, it's not a sole source, I can get other suppliers to do this. But I had a client who had a supplier who missed a lot of deliveries due to what they told my client was a supplier's fire. My client had recently done a sourcing activity selection, so within the last few months. So they went back to other suppliers who didn't get their business at that point in time, but had finished second and third in that outsourcing activity. So they went back to supplier. So they had supplier A who won their sourcing activity, and they said, hey, we got a problem. We can't do this. So they went to supplier B, and just in case, they went to supplier C. And both of those suppliers said, we can't help. Yeah, we bid on that product 6 months ago, but we can't get that material today. So what they found out was all of those suppliers, and come to find out the half dozen or so suppliers that were in this sourcing exercise all got one particular raw material from the same factory in China that happened to have the chemical fire. So no source was available. They thought they had a single source where they had chosen to buy all of their product from supplier A, but that supplier B and C were still viable and they could go back to them. They really had a sole source, but their sole source was at the tier 2 or even the tier 3 level, and that wasn't even something that they recognized. So it wasn't something that on anybody's radar screen to see when that company had a fire that it was going to affect lots and lots of different companies. So if there's one thing that we can take as a silver lining for the pandemic, I think it's that many companies realized they didn't have adequate visibility into their supply chains. And what resulted were a lot of surprises, a lot of pain, and a lot of companies now are saying, okay, we got bit by this once. We don't want that to happen again. So now we want to really understand more about our supply chains. We want to look at what the vulnerabilities are and our exposure is, not only with tier 1, but with tier 2 and tier 3. And we want to understand what are those critical components to our suppliers and their suppliers so that we can ensure that we keep getting the parts and the products we need. So shortages and disruptions are enough to deal with in and of and by themselves, but we know that they can reverberate through and across the supply chain, and that can cause impacts and pains that result from maybe just minor headaches and a couple people losing a little sleep, having to replace rejected lots of material through expediting charges and expediting activities, getting your employees and suppliers to work overtime to kind of make up for that. Yeah, we had something that was short, so now we need to work overtime the next 2 weeks so that we can get back on track and get back on schedule. So you're paying extra money for expediting, you're paying extra money for overtime, and maybe you still are having to expedite to your customers to avoid missing on-time shipments and causing those lost sales or lost customers and things like that, so that you have market share that you might never be able to get back again. So something that starts as minor can really leave gaping holes in a business's goals, monthly, quarterly goals. I have a client whose supplier had capacity issues in the fall of 2021. That caused delays and shipments, extended lead times that we've been working through since, like I say, since about October of 2021. And guess what? We're still dealing with that. So because of personnel issues, because of equipment issues, my client has spent tons of time and resources in travel, in weekly calls, sometimes 2 or 3 calls a week, looking at tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers to try to track the progress, to try to understand what products they can count on to come in. And as you can imagine, as many of you probably relate to, at the end of last month, at the end of December, it was the end of their 4th quarter. And so they really had a significant need to get a lot of product in so they could sell it in their 4th quarter and generate that revenue. So we're dealing with all of these things, and it doesn't always go smoothly. And again, we're trying to placate our customers, make sure that our suppliers have as much information as possible, but balance our forecast revenue with our actual revenue, keep the quality team in and involved in everything where they need to be, and keep from tarnishing our brand, having bad reviews, having issues with that and lost customers, and losing the revenue that we count on to keep the business whole and running smoothly. So we want to measure these impacts. We want to look at things that we can measure, like idle time or the number of unplanned schedule changes. Many companies have a frozen window. They plan their production and they freeze that window for 2-3 weeks, some longer, some shorter, some only a few days or a week. But when you have those unplanned schedule changes, you should record those, and you should record the reason for that. What was the driver? If you have people with idle time or machines with unplanned idle time, then you should record that and record how much time that is, so that you can see how that plays out in the whole scheme of things. Higher freight costs, we've all experienced these for so many reasons. They've come down in recent weeks. The gasoline prices have come down, but material prices are still up. I'm hearing all of my clients say that they're getting updated cost and updated quotes from their supplier saying, hey, we can't produce this for the same price that we were doing that before. We're going to have to increase our costs either this month, next month, this quarter, whatever. We're seeing lost sales from these stoppages and shortages, and that's affecting businesses as well. Loss of market share, that's harder sometimes to measure, and sometimes that takes longer to really figure out, did we just miss some sales, or is that market share that's now gone? And then our reputation, our relationships, all of those things are involved in that. So you have key customers, key suppliers. You want your reputation to be strong with them. You want it to be good, supporting good relationships, and that doesn't always happen. So we have a lot of challenges. So other than throwing up your hands or buying a crystal ball, what can a company do to avoid and minimize impacts from these inevitable shortages and disruptions? So my advice is to use the 4 R's. I'm sorry, I use 4 R's. The first is risk awareness. Make sure your team is thinking about risk in all the decisions they make. So this needs to be throughout the supply chain and actually throughout the whole company. Again, think about what is the risk, what's the probability, what is the impact from that, and then what do we do about that? So before we take 3 steps forward, let's think about what happens if we do that, what happens if we don't do that, and where are we on these risk heat map type things. And then when something happens, the most important thing is to try to restore some kind of order as quickly as possible. Continuity of supply, assurance of supply, those are very, very important. So if you can't get your entire shipment, can you get a partial shipment? Can you get something that's going to keep you going, going to keep your customers going, and is going to help the whole supply chain without shutting everything down cold? And also you want to try to stabilize your cash flow. So even if you can't get the sales that you had projected, can you get some amount of sales to continue and keep that cash flowing up and down that supply chain? Because that's important to all stakeholders in that supply chain, all members of that supply chain. You need clear lines of communication to restore order. And I always say that communication, you cannot over communicate in these types of situations. You need to communicate up and down the supply chain. So you need escalation paths, you need communication paths, points of contact. So when you have these shortages or disruptions, that you're all working together, that everyone is getting the latest and greatest information in a timely fashion. And so that you're not having to wait 3 days to hear what the outcome of some test was, or that you don't get notified 10 minutes before the truck is ready to leave that, hey, yeah, now take over because this is ready to be picked up or ready to be shipped. So look at those kinds of things. The rethink what you do, what you've been doing, what you're doing and what you've been doing. Define your capabilities, your capacities, what you have now, what's in the future. What do you need going forward? What's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? So get out of the, we know how to handle this, or this is the way we've always done it, because there are new challenges and the old ways don't always do that. So don't be afraid to rethink a situation, a solution, an option. And then redesign. Design your supply chains around what you want to be now and in the future. Look at your current operating models, future operating models. Think about next-gen capabilities and design those supply chains, put the architecture together that is something that is deliberate and not just evolves over time. To minimize disruptions, you want to look at reducing the risk, transferring the risk or sharing the risk with other members of the supply chain. Figure out what risks you're willing to accept and what you're going to do about things if they do happen there, what risks you can avoid, and put your effort into this risk-based thinking and problem solving. So real-time communication, regular risk assessments. I used to say if you did a risk assessment with your key suppliers once a year, that was sufficient. Now it's not. Now, sometimes I tell clients with their key suppliers, they need to be doing these risk assessments quarterly and at least twice a year, because so much can change within 3 or 4 months or 6 months. And this is a good time to do that. It's January. Companies expect that. It's a good time to look at your suppliers, to look at your supplier management, who's in that critical box, which are the relationships that you need, what's the risk that's lurking out there, do we have the right team and talent to handle that, and then what's the performance that we've had from suppliers recently, and what's the performance that we need from suppliers going forward through the rest of this year. So you want to collaborate, look at backup suppliers, diversify your supply base, and use contingency plans. That can be with inventory, with dual sourcing, multiple sourcing, and communicate those plans throughout your organization so that you don't surprise somebody by saying, oh, this vendor's having problems, now we're going to use this vendor. If we're going to use that vendor, you want to make sure the quality people know about that, the marketing people, the engineering team, so that you don't have a lot of surprises in there. This is a flexibility formula that I found that I like. They say the visibility plus the flexibility equals the value. So look at both the response and the proactivity kinds of things you can do in order to put the visibility in place and then make it flexible, and that's going to yield the value. So this is a good reference, and this Everstream had a nice article that you can take a look at offline. So what I know for sure is there's a better way. There's a better way to manage risk awareness. There's a better way to integrate flexibility in and through the organization to become more flexible and resilient, and to put responses in place so that you're not just, well, let's wait and see what happens, that you have activities that you can start, that you can begin, that you can try to get things back on track, and document your lessons learned so that you know what happened and you can prevent that from recurring. That's a very important part of that. So things happen, and we all know in supply chain, again, Murphy is alive and well. Think about your last surprise. What happened that you didn't expect, not in a positive way, or maybe sometimes in a positive way? Where did your market go through the roof that you didn't think it would be? Doing that. What do you think the source of your next disruption is, or the cause of that is? Are you ready, and is your company ready? Do you need assistance or help? And if so, what you can do is you can get a free callwithjane.com. You just go to this link, callwithjane.com will take you right to my calendar, and you can sign up for a free half hour to talk to me about any challenges that you have, any readiness issues for 2023 that you'd like to go over, or anything else that I or purplelink can help you with. So if you want to do this, if you do this in the next 24 hours, then you get to be in a drawing that I do every quarter for some extra prizes. And if you would like some other information, like I say, I'm starting a CPSM exam class. If you would like to get your CPSM, or if there are members of your team that you think would benefit from that, I'm starting that up. You can contact me about that. And I'm also going to do a compliance workshop starting the 1st of March. That's going to talk about different aspects of supply compliance in and across the supply chain. So now I'm going to do the raffle. So if you'd like a copy of these slides, you need to email me and be part of this raffle. And that email is, again, jane@purplelink.co. I think Kathy put it into the chat. So send me an email and just put webinar in the subject, or ISM or something like that, and I will choose a winner here shortly. CPSM exam is starting in February of 2023. So we're starting that. The Lean and Six Sigma is going to be later it's probably Q2, as well as the risk-based thinking. But as I said, I'm going to start a compliance workshop in that time frame. So anybody like to participate in the webinar or would like to get the slides from that? I'm going to see if I can refresh this. Help if I got on the right one. And actually, I'm not seeing anybody. Did anybody like to participate? If not, you can always send me your email after the fact, and I will be happy to send you the slides. And I am doing dynamic dialogue webinars once a month. You can get on my my distribution list. I do those once a month. I'm going to start those again in February. I have some issues for January that have precluded that. Usually I do them on the third Thursday. And my plan is to keep that schedule. I'm sorry, the fourth Thursday of the month. And so that would be on February 23rd. And that webinar is going to be about resilience. So we're going to talk about supply chain resilience. So that's what I have for presenting today. I'm going to stop. I have one thing to leave you with. And this is something that I thought it made me smile, so might make some of you smile as well. So when we're thinking about attacking 2023 and what we're going to do in supply chain, this meeting, you can see the profits and the sales aren't really going in the right direction. And they say, what if we don't change anything at all and something magical just happens? So I had a boss that I greatly admired one time and respected. And he said frequently, hope is not a plan. So if you just hope things are going to get better, that's not really a plan. And I hoped I would win the lottery the other night, and I actually bought a $2 ticket. But guess what? I don't live in Maine, and I didn't win that lottery. So, but my plan wasn't really to spend that however many $100 million you'd be left with after you won that pot. So it was a hope, it was a dream. Didn't happen, but it didn't ruin my day, and it didn't ruin the rest of my life. So if you don't think that we need to change, then we need to change some things, not everything wholesale and not wholesale and not for the sake of change, but what do we need to change and what's going to help us in this new year? So that's what I have for you today. Like I said, now I will stop sharing and I'll take questions, comments, whatever.
I think a question everyone's going to ask is, are the slides going to be available after this, Kathy? And I feel like the answer is you have to email Jane and she'll send them to you.
That's right.
That's correct.
So everybody, you can email Jane and she can send them to you directly. But if you have questions and you don't want to ask right now, you can
email me questions.
Yep.
Tonight, tomorrow, if you think of something in 3 days, sometimes that's what I do. I attend a webinar or something and I think, why didn't I ask that? Or I don't think they covered that. I wonder if I could go back and ask that question. So you're welcome to do that with my email.
Perfect. Well, thank you for coming and thank you for the presentation. It was very impactful and important. It just reminds us that, change is inevitable. And disruptions will happen.
Disruptions happen, yes.
Yeah, it's all how you deal with them. And Murphy, like you said, is still alive. So
yes. So I wish you all a happy and successful 2023.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Jane. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Leanna. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Take care.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.